This conference will now be recorded.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bailey. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy day to kind of stop in here and listen to us explain a little bit about our community of practice that we're in the process of putting together and launching early 2021. I would just go very quickly through introductions. Then we'll talk shortly about kind of how the next 45 minutes is going to go, and we'll try to save you as much time as possible. My name is Tom Jones. I'm an education consultant with the Wyoming Department of Education. I actually work in the Special Education Programs Division, where I manage the State Systemic Improvement Plan and the State Personnel Development Grant. And that's where a lot of this work really started from. We'll talk kind of about the evolution here in a minute. I'll go ahead and I'll let Dr. Bailey and Sasha introduce themselves.
Robin, if you will just make sure your phone is muted, we're getting a little feedback from you. So my name is Ceci Rose Bailey, and I'm a principal consultant for the National Center on Intensive Intervention. And we have entered into a contract with the Wyoming Department of Ed to provide intensive technical assistance. And it's not for those who are most at risk, like you might think for MTSS, but it's for those who are most committed to scaling up services for students with the most intensive needs. I'm going to let my colleague introduce herself, Sasha.
Hi, my name is Sasha Cartagena, and I'm a current doctoral candidate at the University of Central Florida, and I will be supporting this community of practice with NCII. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, great. Thank you all. So really just welcome. And our session purpose today is really to talk a little bit about database individualization, intensive intervention, where it came from, look at some of the data. We want to talk about the successes that Wyoming has had with it, and then really talk about this scale-up attempt through this community of practice that is being supported by the National Center on Intensive Intervention. And of course, last but not least, we asked the administrators to come together for this because we do want to encourage you to support your teachers in attending this opportunity. So our session agenda, welcome, which we've made it through. Here in just a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bailey, and she's going to talk briefly about what the National Center on Intensive Intervention is and what they do, and how they're going to function here within the state of Wyoming for this collaborative. And then I'm going to take it over and talk again a little bit about DBI, its history, its evolution, and we'll look at some data that we've seen come out of the project. Then we'll jump very quickly into the community of practice requirements and the roles of the administrators. And we'll try to save 5 to 10 minutes. It's a lot of information, but we're going to try to save 5 to 10 minutes toward the end of the session, really just for a good quality question answer and next steps. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, please submit those into the chat pod, and Sasha is monitoring that for us, so we'll be able to stop and answer those questions as we go. And then also, as I already mentioned at the end of the session, we will have a formal Q&A time period. So Dr. Bailey, if you want to take over.
Great, thanks, Tom. And hopefully some of you have had an opportunity to check out the National Center on Intensive Intervention. The center is actually moving into its 10th year of federal funding. The primary purpose of the center is to support states and local education agencies in designing and implementing services for students with the most intensive and persistent learning needs. The center actually was the follow-up center to the National RTI Center, because the work that came out of the RTI Center focused a lot on Tier 1 and Tier 2, and there seemed to be a greater need for Tier 3 in students with disabilities. The center promotes a validated approach to providing intensive intervention at Tier 3 as the bridge between Tier 3 and special education and within special education. It is a 5-step process. It has about 30 years of evidence base, and it is domain agnostic. And I think that's really clear. We want to make clear today is it's not unique to literacy or math or behavior or social emotional, and it's not really unique to a particular grade. Here in the state of Wyoming, we've actually been working with Part C as well as kids who are in the preschool. In some of our other states, we've actually been working with students at the high school level as well. it is a process, and we make that very clear that it's not a particular intervention. It does not depend on a particular assessment tool. So that's why it's really widely applicable across different grade levels, domains, and different types of settings. And it's not a one-time fix. And for those kids who actually have more persistent and significant learning needs, what we find is that a single intensification or adaptation often doesn't meet their needs. So they need an ongoing process to really help us design interventions that are individualized to student needs. We have a number of resources that have been developed by teachers for teachers, as well as by researchers for implementation practices. And so for those teachers who do choose to participate in the community of practice, they'll have access to all of those tools. We will focus on building their capacity to use those tools in a much more efficient and proficient way. So this resource right here outlines all of the steps. You can find that on the website. We also have some resources for administrators. Sasha's going to put a link to this particular document in the chat box. And it's really around why we need to support this in our schools. What we find is that we are seeing a mass exodus of educators coming, staying in the field and, coming into the field. We don't get a lot of new educator prep applicants. And part of that is that people feel like they don't know what they're supposed to do. And Tom's going to share a video, not play it, but share a video that we created that demonstrated that teachers who built their capacity in providing, working through these 5 steps felt more empowered and more confident in their teaching, not just of students with severe learning needs, but for students at the Tier 2 and even the Tier 1 level. We have a number of learning modules that we will share during the community of practice for participants. So those are also available for folks at no charge. We are a federal center, so everything we put out is open source. And in fact, a lot of the resources that we have can be customized within your particular site to really match your context as well as the language that you use. And finally, for the participants who do choose to be part of this collaborative or this community of practice, we understand that working in the virtual setting, working as an isolated rural teacher, there are some unique contexts that we want to be able to take into account. We have been focusing since March, the closure of schools, and how do we effectively support teachers in delivering virtual intervention. And we will share some of those resources as well. But we will be grouping teachers into kind of coaching pods based on their particular needs or context so that they can work collaboratively with other Wyoming educators. So I'm going to pass it over to Tom, and he's going to share with you all some of the great work that's already happened in the state and some of the really measurable effects that we've seen.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey. So as she already alluded to, just very quickly, I'm going to give you a little bit of background as far as where DBI originated, at least for the state, and kind of where we've gone. Our pilot year was 2016-17. It really was brought about as a part of the state systemic improvement plan, which is in the special education division, where we had an initial focus of working with just 3rd grade students and their reading proficiency for the individuals that spent the majority of their time in the resource room. Almost within the first year, and you'll notice that it says 2017-18, we changed our implementation model because we realized it was going to be, it was more advantageous to look at larger groups. And so what we did is we established district, we call them incubation sites or demonstration sites. But everything else for the most part stayed the same. By 2018-19, the model stayed the same, but this time we changed what we were actually doing as part of that implementation. And all of this is based on our stakeholder feedback or the expressed needs of the districts. We hold meetings every year where we meet with these individuals and they tell us what worked, what didn't, and how we can improve things. So by 18-19, we expanded our focus. Rather than being just in 3rd grade, we looked at expanding from K to 6. Rather than just reading, we supported districts in math and behavior, etc. We also established pre-K demonstration sites in Laramie and Campbell counties to work with our 3rd through, I was going to say 5-year-olds, but yeah, so our pre-K clientele. we adopted a domain agnostic position in effort to support districts, whereas before we were extracting the information or the data that we needed to send to the federal, the Office of Special Education Programs. And by 1819, we realized we support the district across the board in all of the different domain areas, whether it be math, reading, behavior, so forth. We've also established internal coaching cadres within our DBI incubation sites and districts to help with sustainability within those districts. And then probably what I think is the watershed moment for a lot of what we've done with the process is we introduced and refined an internal teaming process. And initially this was really just on the SPED side, but over time it gained a lot of interest within the general education population of buildings and districts. So in 1920, we began training general education teachers and administrators to use this in their bid processes. Very successful in a number of them. We trained, and I'm trying to think here, I want to say 10, may have been 10 buildings back in January of 2000. And then in March, we trained about 13 more. Unfortunately, the training took place on the Friday before COVID shutdown. So since then, we've had some buildings that have attempted to bring this in. Others are still kind of working through the process, but the knowledge is out there, and we're just trying to capitalize on that with some of the buildings that have been through the training. We also recognize the need, obviously, because of the COVID shutdown, that we needed a virtual way to provide similar trainings. So we developed Canvas training modules at the department that we can push out to the districts for their learning management system as well. And that brings us current, where we're in the process of organizing a statewide community of practice designed to get this information out, provide more teachers, both in the special ed realm as well as the general education realm, to be able to facilitate this. We've also further expanded our grade levels, where it was before it was just, third grade, then K through 6. We're now looking at K through 8. And starting this year, we have field tested our Canvas training modules. We hope that early next, I guess it was the next semester at this point, we're almost 2021, that we'll be able to start pushing out a finalized version of those to interested districts. So by the numbers, and I'm going to go fairly quickly through a little bit of the data that we've pulled, but I want to kind of provide a caveat to this. And the first thing is most of the data we have is not as current as we would like it, and a lot of that is because of the COVID shutdown and the lack of testing. So when you see the dates, it's going to be the last available data that we have coming out of this. The other thing too is, and I want you to keep this in the back of your mind, is because the type of student that we asked our practitioners, educators to select for this really, I think, lends itself to the impact of what you're going to see in these numbers. And what that was is when we went to the educators and we said, we need you to select at least one student to start this pilot. And of course, the first question is, well, what student should I select? And we told them the one that makes you want to pull your hair out, right? The one that is trying so hard, but is not making any progress or little progress, right? So we really wanted to target with this, because it is a tier 3 initiative, those students with the most significant and persistent learning barriers or barriers to learning. And you can see already here at the DBI by the numbers, we do an end of year survey where we go through and we crunch some of the numbers, and the percentage of students who improved at least a little bit from the start of the intervention, 96%. Again, that's 96% of the hardest students that you're going to find in a building. Percentage of students for whom DBI was at least a little bit successful. Again, 96% of these students made at least or showed a little bit of success. And then you have finally the percentage of students whose progress monitoring scores increased, 92%. What's really interesting about that 92% as well is if you look on the right-hand side, and I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about the weekly log, but part of the program is we ask our practitioners, educators, to keep a weekly log of the fidelity of implementation for the intervention. So when they go through, they're going to mark down things like, was the student present? Was the student engaged, right? Was the intervention delivered as intended? How much time was actually spent? And we go through and we compile all this data. So going back to the 92%, given enough time, we could go back and look at those fidelity logs, and I could probably, we could determine exactly what happened to that remaining 8%. And that's really what's wonderful about this process, is the amount of data that it provides to help guide instructional decision making. Some other really quick, and this is looking at a state as a whole. You'll notice kind of that gold or orange color. These are our DBI schools that we're implementing between 17 and 18. And you'll see here in the black is the state numbers. And in 1 year, looking at third grade students with disabilities scoring proficient, in 1 year, we moved 8.25% of those kids into a proficient category. Conversely, you can look at how many students scoring below basic moved up. So in 17-18, again, 53.85% of students, third grade students with disabilities, were scoring below basic, and within 1 year we moved 13.22% of those kids to either basic or above. All right. Further, what we tried to do is we've looked at this a number of different ways, because there's a lot of other stories. Anybody knows when we look at data, there's a lot of other stories that go to it. So we've tried to look at it as many different ways as we can. And in this case, again, still looking at third grade students with disabilities scoring proficient, but we wanted to compare them to other matched schools. So schools with the similar characteristics in other districts throughout the state. And you can see really clearly what happened here. The red is our non-DBI matched schools throughout the state. The green is our DBI implementing schools. Again, spring of 18 started out very close, but by the time we get to spring of 19, there's a very discernible gap in the amount of students that have scored proficient. On the right-hand side, when we look at those scoring basic and above, you're going to see even a larger gap, looking at the exact same data. We further took that even a little more in depth, looking at the exact same thing, but this time we added in just one more metric. Let's look at the buildings within the same district that's implementing, except for those schools that are not implementing. And you can see how that played out. Again, the thing that you want to pay attention to is that green line. And this is, remember, 1 year with those students with the greatest obstacle to learning. So amazing data that comes out of that. One of the other things that we've looked at, and Dr. Bailey and I presented on this just, I want to say in October, is what about the COVID shutdown? And what we found is that a lot of the teachers that we had worked with were very comfortable with the process, and they adapted readily to the situation. So the next 5 students really is just some really quick student level data showing what happened with these students during the COVID closure. This individual student, if you look here in the fall, this is a math screening, obviously has much to be desired, but by May, their numbers are significantly increased. The one that impresses me the most, and I always kind of jokingly say this, is multiply to 12. They scored a 7 out of 7. I think I could get to 11. I don't know if I could do that for the 12. So as sad as that is to say. Student number 2, second grade student, you can see this, came in with a baseline of 9 words correct per minute and established a goal of 72 on a first grade level. So the catch is they're 1 grade level below where they should be. But if you look at the screening data, by winter, they were moved to a second grade level because they had already achieved a 79 out of their goal with being a 72. So in 4 months, and I say we, I shouldn't say me, the practitioner, by using this process, moved this student back onto grade level, right? And so they established that. Third grade student, 33 words correct with a goal of 68. They met with the student 4 days a week, 30 minutes utilizing Orton Gillingham. Again, in the fall, 33. I did not have data for the winter screening, but again, by May, they had exceeded their initially established goal of 68 by hitting 78 words correct per minute, despite the closure. Student 4, this was a student that wasn't qualified for services until December of last year. Their services didn't even start until January 20th of this year. They had a baseline of 68, and they reached 78 words correct per minute in May, despite, again, the closure, the COVID shutdown. And again, you can see at the bottom, they're meeting with the students 4 days a week, 30 minutes using Orton Gillingham. Student 5, which is probably my favorite one to talk about, because there's an interesting story that is not necessarily readily available in the data. But this is a second grade student who's hearing impaired and has a language disability. Their baseline was a 0 of 7 in comprehension. The teacher noted that from February through April, the student was still only getting 0 of 7. So during the COVID shutdown in March, and then going through May, this student goes from 0 to 5 of 7. And both the classroom teacher as well as the speech and language path have both reported increased student performance. What you're not seeing here is the process that's taking place. And the teacher, every 4 to 6 data points, is revisiting both the student performance data as well as that fidelity log, and either meeting it as a team or with a coach and making a decision on what needs to be changed. And we see this every now and then where we may have gone through 3, 4, maybe 5 different iterations, the student's not making progress, but finally you land on something that makes sense to that student, it clicks, and they just blow up. And that's exactly what you see happening here. Just very quickly, I know, again, I think we're running out of time. You have practitioner comments as part of our end of the year stakeholder practitioner review groups. They provide a survey for us that includes some of the practitioner comments. And I think some of these are very, very powerful. When they talk about, I can look at an intervention and see how effective it is, right? They feel more confident in even selecting, and this one's here in the middle, what is monitoring, what it is not, and how to research curriculum. It's applicable to what they do all the time, or they're using it in a day-to-day practice. And that's important because the process itself isn't really asking just one more thing of a teacher. It's really just an overlay that, asks to be more intentional in the process that they're already doing. You'll notice here, I no longer spend more time assessing than I do teaching. So some of the teachers and practitioners that have done this in the past can tell you that in some ways it's actually freed their time up. And then again, to the bottom left just talks about understanding goals and setting goals. Dr. Bailey had mentioned this before. About 1.5 years ago, the National Center on Intensive Intervention spotlighted the work that the state of Wyoming was doing. And this is actually located on our Wyoming Instructional Network. We won't watch it now because it is about 14.5 minutes long, but I would recommend, if you find time, to please look at this. Unfortunately, I also talk in this, but you can fast forward through those scenes. But really pay attention to the practitioners and what the process has done for them in the classroom. We have parents on there that talk about what the process has done for their children. And we even have a few children on there, our students, that will talk about, and this is the difference. We always talk in terms of like growth and percentiles. And when you get the students on there and they talk about how the process has affected them, they talk about it in terms of their life. I think sometimes, maybe not everybody, but sometimes when you're looking at data, we tend to miss that. And so it is a very powerful story. So if you get an opportunity, I would recommend that you review that. I think, and then this right here is showing the Wyoming Instructional Network. If you want to know more about that, if you go here, I think the link, and it is in the chat now. Thank you, Sasha. You can come in and just go to the DBI. It's going to provide you a lot of the information that Dr. Bailey has kind of pointed to. There's a ton of resources on there. There's a lot of Wyomingized resources that we have used. A lot of that has been refined based on stakeholder input, but that is readily available, including the video that I just kind of talked about.
And I just want to piggyback on what Tom was saying about the video, because it is very powerful and it goes beyond just the numbers game, right? It's more than just demonstrating that DBI led to measurable progress. We know that's really important. But from the educator standpoint, you will hear many of them talk about how it re-energized them, right? They started to feel highly effective. They felt confident in their work. And if you are familiar with the high leverage practices, you will know that intensive intervention is actually listed as a high leverage practice for those teachers working at the tier 2, tier 3 level. And so it's not only an evidence-based practice, it's also a high leverage practice, something that we do on a day-to-day basis. And I will say through this work, Wyoming has received a lot of positive national attention. And a lot of states are looking to model what has been happening in their states, including Georgia, Arizona, Texas, and Colorado. So I want to give a lot of kudos to the state. It's also why Wyoming was invited to be part of this intensive technical assistance that's available through this national center. And our goal today is to offer some opportunities for educators as well. And so I'm going to share what some of those are. In the chat box, you will see a link to an informational handout. It is on the state Google Drive, and it lists out everything that I'm going to share today. It's also in the application that we will share at the end of this session if you are interested in participating. It is a stipend participation. There is a collaborative effort between the state and the National Center on Intensive Intervention to support both educators that are participating in the community of practice opportunities, as well as the coaches who are in-state Wyoming teachers who have been implementing for at least a year, who will be supporting local educators in their implementation. And I'll talk a little bit more about the stipend towards the end. There are really three main opportunities. They kind of come as a package deal, so it's not that you do one and not the other. And this is based on what we know works in the state. As Tom mentioned, he's been overseeing the state systemic improvement plan. It is a systematic review of the impact of these efforts, not just at the student level, but at the educator level. So the way the professional learning is designed, the sequencing, the timing, all of that is based on an iterative process that has occurred over the last 3 years in Wyoming, and is intended to produce maximum effects in the most efficient way. We will be offering a community of practice. It is a 6-session community of practice in which educators are expected to participate actively in at least 5 of the 6 sessions. They are spread out over the course of 12 weeks from January until March. And in between those sessions, there is like an optional check-in with a coach. And we know that the coach is really critical for support. While we can increase your knowledge and skills, we know coaching is essential to really change practice and make it feasible. As Tom mentioned, this is not something in addition to. This is really about being very intentional and focus on what we do for these students. We don't really have a window, to sort of figure things out, meaning we need to be as intentional and as intense as we can be from the beginning. And that's what DBI is really meant to help teachers do. There's a lot of resources that are part of this work as well. Some of these are new resources that will only be accessible to those in the community of practice. And then upon the completion of the community of practice, we will be releasing them for broad dissemination. So those who end up participating will get sort of things well before they are ever released to others. Now, our intended outcomes are kind of threefold. One is we're really looking to build the knowledge and skills of educators supporting those students with the most intensive needs. Now, we know that's part of building local capacity, but we also know that coaching is a critical piece of it. So we will, NCII in particular, will be working directly with a cohort of about 8 to 10 state coaches to build their knowledge and skills to effectively support local educators in their implementation. And they will then support NCII in the implementation of the community of practice. Our ultimate goal, of course, is to improve the outcomes of those students who have typically shown little to no growth. And as you saw from Tom's presentations, we have been able to see that systematically over the last several years. Now, the community of practice that we're proposing will support between 30 and 50 practitioners, and the number of coaches that we end up supporting will be dependent upon the number of folks who end up, being in the practice itself. Those who are in the community of practice will be divided into pods that will have direct support from a coach. So it's not like a passive sit and get. It's more of a come learn with your colleagues, really engage in some authentic conversations about how do we make this practical. I think our early adopters really learned that there are a lot of systems barriers, and that's why we've invited administrators here today that sometimes interfere with a teacher's ability to effectively provide intensive intervention. And so that's what they'll have these pods to really sort of address some of those, but get direct support in how do we overcome those or prevent those from happening. I mentioned it's a bi-weekly session. We will be doing it after school, so there's no need for a sub. But it does require maybe a little bit of your off-school time, and that's why we are providing a financial stipend as well as free technical assistance in return for your participation. The coaching will be virtual, of course, and it would be either meeting with your little coaching pod, or it could be through emails or phone calls, whatever your needs are at that time. And then the focus of the community of practice will really be on the DBI process, not a particular intervention, not a particular progress monitoring tool, and it will not be overly focused on any particular domain. So that teachers who are interested in working with a kid with severe behavior problems can also be working alongside a teacher who has a student with severe math learning needs. There are some requirements, and these are outlined both in the informational sheet as well as the application, is that we ask that all of those who participate in the community of practice choose one student, as Tom mentioned. And we do encourage you to pick that kid where you're not seeing a lot of growth. It's not like we can make it worse, right? So what we're trying to do is really build your capacity, provide as much support as we can from the federal, the state, and local level to really help you individualize the supports for that student so we can see that growth. There will be some, gosh, I should have changed that again, asynchronous learning activities, and those will be about 15 to 20 minutes, probably on a weekly basis, more just to build your content knowledge so that you can engage in some robust conversation. I mentioned the 5 to 6 sessions. We know that life happens. You may not be able to attend. But we are looking for active participants. So if you're an administrator thinking about the teachers to participate, think about those who are likely to be the go-getters, because they are going to be the ones who will be able to transfer this knowledge from the community of practice to your local site. We do ask the participants share their learning with their local site, whether it's other educators, maybe at a staff meeting or with your principal, to think about how this can really benefit the system as a whole versus just the individual students of the participating teacher. And finally, there are some requirements that will lead to the stipend, the release of the stipend. And there are 3 main things. They're actually part of the DBI process. They're kind of evidence that it happened. One is the completion of a student plan, and that's really documenting what you're doing with the students. What are the dimensions of your program or your intervention? The next thing, like Tom said about fidelity, we do request at least 1 week of fidelity data. We'll give you a standardized form in which to do that. It is a very telling piece of data that has helped us realize that most kids do not receive the level of intense supports that they need. On paper, it looks like it, but in practice, it often doesn't happen. And then finally, we ask that as a culminating project, that you're sharing progress monitoring data for at least 1 student. This doesn't need to be a purchased progress monitoring tool. There are a number of free tools out there, and we also have a free graphing system if you need that. But it's more about presenting your story. And if you want to see a little bit of example of that, check out the video that Tom shared. And it's just a very snippet about where you started, how did you get to where you're getting to in order to change the progress for the student. So once those data requirements are met, then we will be stipending participants $400 to participate. So that's 6 sessions over 12 weeks. And then the completion of these products, or these activities, which would actually be part of what you would typically do as part of your work, but much more intentional and specific. The dates are outlined in the informational session. These are hard dates, and we just had to do that in order to get something on the calendar. So if you feel like this is not going to work with your current setting, you coach at this time, or maybe you don't have daycare. The whole idea of this is to really pilot it as something that can be replicated and sustained within the state. So maybe you don't get the first cohort, but there will be opportunities, hopefully in the future, if we can make sure that this is efficient and effective. After the session will be 3:30 to 4:30. Participating coaches who do receive a little bit larger stipend will stay on an additional 30 minutes each of those time to really ensure that they're prepared to support their local coaching pod. And so just a reminder about who our coaches are. They are local Wyoming educators. They do come from sites in which DBI has been implemented successfully based on the data. And they have at least 1 year of experience. Some of them have multiple years in doing this work. NCII, as part of our intensive supports, will be directly supporting the coaches. So there is a direct line for national experts, resources, and tools that all educators, whether they're a coach or a local educator, will have access to. We did invite administrators intentionally to this session because we know administrators play a critical role in a teacher's ability to successfully implement intensive intervention. So as you're thinking about who you think would be a great participant in this or would benefit your school, we want to make sure that you also understand as your role an administrator is to ensure that that teacher has sufficient time to really dive into the information, practice what they're doing, share with other educators within the site. And then also make sure that as we do identify maybe potential barriers to implementing, and I'll just give you an example. We had a teacher who was providing intensive intervention for a small group of students, and every day they would get an interruption from the administrator to, take care of this kid's behavior problem, or can you talk to so-and-so's mom? And when they calculated the amount of time that was being lost to those interruptions, they realized it was having a negative effect on the students. So part of that process was to really say, we know that these things need to be taken care of. How can we protect, the time that's being delivered to these students so that they're getting adequate duration or intensity of supports? And so that's where we'll need the administrators to really be an active collaborator and supporter of this work. So I'm going to pass this over to Tom, who will facilitate some questions. So please put those in the chat box, but give you a sense about what happens next and how can teachers participate.
All right, thank you, Dr. Bailey. You can see here is my email at the Wyoming Department of Ed. Feel free if you have questions between now and then. Our deadline for submissions is December 18th, but if you have questions between now and then, feel free to contact me at any time. I'll get back to you as soon as possible. There's a link that just got placed in the chat that is, in fact, this community of practice. We call it, it says application. It's more of just an interest form. It asks me, or it may ask you, like, has anybody else ever in your district or that you know of ever participated within the services? Yes or no, and then provide information about which practitioners are interested and so forth. And then it also lays out what the practitioner will receive as far as in supports and services. It also has the dates and times as well as what is required in terms of activities and data reporting. The only other thing I wanted to add real quick, and I know Dr. Bailey had covered this, we also covered it this morning, but I've had a large number of participants from this morning's session that had pretty much the same question. So I want to go ahead and just address that again. And that is the number one question we get is there any type of programmatic requirements that we have to use this program, or how prescriptive is the progress monitoring piece? And the answer to that is there isn't any. We're not going to ask you to change what program you're using or what progress monitoring tool that you're using. We may ask you to evaluate the effectiveness of whatever the programmatic piece is, but this is really just an overlay framework that ask teachers just to be more intentional about what they're already doing. So I think it's important to kind of say that again, because we do continue to get questions on that, and that's no problem. It's a good concern to have.
And just to piggyback on that, I mean, it really is around becoming proficient with the process, because that we know that good teachers can take materials and really enhance or intensify them to be effective in a number of situations. And we want to honor that expertise. And so that's why there's no requirement for a particular program. But we do ask, like Tom mentioned, for people to really be honest about the limitations and the strengths of what they have in place. We know there's nothing that's perfect about anything that's out there. And as long as we understand those limitations, when we go to problem solve about the student, we can really be honest about what needs to change, whether it's the way we deliver, the way we design, the way we schedule. So it just allows us to be more intentional with our work. So we have about 5 minutes, 4 to 5 minutes, and we're going to stay on to see if you have any questions. Feel free to type those in the chat box. Or if you want to unmute and ask those, feel free to do that as well. If you do unmute, I ask that you share your video, because it will pop up and let us know that you want to share something. And then you can turn it off.
Hi guys, this is Alana Engel in Rollins. How are you?
Great, how you doing?
Good. Hey, I wanted to ask you questions a little bit about timing. Obviously, I'm special ed, and so I'm worrying about, like, you know, how this would affect an IEP. But if a parent volunteers, I don't think it really matters. Could I be seeing the kid like 30 minutes after school? Would that be
what we want you to do, this is not in addition to the IEP services that you're already providing. So what we're going to ask you to do as part of that student plan is just to articulate the dimensions of the program, right? And we want to be able to be specific about those. So when we do see a certain level of progress, we can make claims or, you know, attribute some of that growth to some of those components. So it's not any more than you're doing. Now, what we have found was when we're much more intentional, particularly with special ed services, we actually see over time, kids need less intensive supports. I think Tom had talked about that. And that's really about trying to be intentional. I think protecting that special education time, that's where, you know, that collaboration between the administrator and the educator, we've seen huge gains for students as well.
Absolutely.
So nothing more, just really intentional about what you're doing.
Staying within their program as it says,
Yes,
right?
ma'am. Yes,
okay,
ma'am.
cool. Thank you.
There is a limit of the, yeah.
What is the limit of the cohort?
Thanks, Sasha. Yeah, so the limit of the cohort right now, we have up to 50 is what we're looking at. So is that right, Tom?
Well, right. So and the other thing I was going to throw out there is just, I mean, this day one, and we're about 30% full of what we're looking for, and that's just from this morning's session. So.
And as Tom mentioned, the deadline is next Friday. And the reason we did it next Friday is for once people go on vacation, we get vacation brain. But it also gives us time to really make sure that people are grouped with their appropriate coaches, that we have appropriate registration, everything set up so that we're go time on that first day. All right, we have about 1 more minute, and so we'll stay on about 1 or 2 more minutes if you have any questions. Yeah, so I'm getting a private chat, so I won't mention the person's name, but I do think, yes, that is something those topics, goal writing, progress monitoring, and analyzing data are critical pieces of the DBI process. So this would be an appropriate match, and the grade level that you're talking about is also an appropriate match. So I hope that helps. Good. Okay. Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions, but as Tom mentioned, please contact him at any time. You have a week to talk to your educators. Make sure it's a good fit. They understand the requirements, and we're looking forward to seeing those applications.
Absolutely. Thank
All
you so
right.
much, Dr. Bailey.